Howdy friends, welcome back to the program Dollars and Cents. This is Joel Garris of Nelson Financial Planning, talking a little bit on the program today about a situation that is actually affecting over 1 in 10 Americans. And if you are a millennial, the chances of it affecting you are actually about 1 in 5. And that's the situation where you've got an aging parent who needs your financial support. And the numbers are getting worse and worse on this as people live longer, as things like healthcare continue to go up. A lot of elderly are finding that they're not able to make ends meet, and they're turning to that next generation. Particularly among the millennials, you see this happening based upon the surveys and the studies out there. So we're trying to give some ideas to help you if you find yourself in that situation, to give you some level of definition. And if on the other hand you're the recipient of that, then also these are some suggestions for you as well to help engage in that intergenerational conversation, whereby you've got to get into the full detail and the full disclosure of exactly what the overall financial picture looks like, including how that money is getting spent on a monthly basis. And then from there, to try and establish some boundaries and get to the bottom of what exactly is creating the overspending, if that in fact is the part of the problem. Oftentimes overspending can be a symptom of other things. People will go and spend money more on an emotional basis, and if there's a loss of a spouse or other issues, then perhaps that may be helping or hurting, as the case may be, the overall expenditure of money. So certainly some things to look at, and obviously an addendum to that would be to make sure that you are investigating whatever possible programs are out there, whether that's through the VA or the U.S. government. There's low-income housing options, and of course VA benefits. Medicare Advantage is another way that you could potentially reduce down the overall cost of how much they're paying for Medicare and their Part B and their Part D prescription plan. So there's some options out there, but it's going to require some detective work on your end if you are finding yourself in the position of having to support your parents on a financial basis. Bottom line, it's going to be disruptive. It may be, the sooner though you dig into that, the easier it's going to be. As with anything, if you wait and let it continue to develop as a problem, the problem is only going to get harder to solve over time. So some things to be thinking about if you find yourself in the position of having to support elderly parents. Important to have that conversation, establish boundaries, and really get down into exactly what's going on in terms of the overall spending. So certainly some things to be thinking about, particularly if you find yourself in that position that more and more Americans are finding themselves in. Speaking of things that are trickier than they ever have been, one of the things that we often encounter these days is this notion of charitable giving and what you can and cannot do under the new tax laws as they exist today. And obviously, as they exist today may very well change, but we know that what the picture is going to look like for the year 2019. First of all, when it comes to charitable giving, there are some tricks that you want to try and observe to take advantage of the ability to get a tax savings when you make a charitable contribution. Now, for a while now on the program, we've been talking about the qualified charitable distribution, the QCD, which allows you to give your required minimum distribution directly to a charity, and that allows you to not have to even report as income on your tax return the amount of your required minimum distribution from your retirement accounts that went directly to charities. Now remember, it's got to go directly to the charity, right? It's got to go directly there, because otherwise it doesn't count as a qualified charitable distribution. So we've been talking about that. That's a great feature. We're having a lot of folks come into the office this month and finish up their charitable giving, finish up their required minimum distribution, sort of wrap it all up into one, and a great way to reduce your taxes. But what if you don't have a required minimum distribution? And what if you have perhaps already used your required minimum distribution for the year? What are the other things that you can do? Well, it starts with understanding some of the typical restrictions that exist on a charitable contribution. First of all, in order to get the tax benefit of a charitable contribution, you must itemize your deductions. This is where it gets a little tricky in today's world, because less people itemize their deductions. It went from about a third of the population down to about 10% of the population that itemizes their deductions. Why? Because the standard deduction went up as much as it did. So for a single person, it's $12,000. For a couple, it's $24,000. You actually get an additional part of a deduction if you are over age 65. So the notion that you're going to be able to write off your charitable giving or itemize your deductions, because that's the only way to do it, is less and less for folks. So that's kind of the first thing you've sort of got to wrap your hands around and figure out a way to get around, or perhaps achieve some tax savings of that charitable giving in other ways. So we've got some ideas on that. First of all, though, when you make a charitable contribution, you've got to make sure it's actually a charity. No, your kids, your parents, your friends, they're not charities. The charity is, maybe they are, but they're probably not legally recognized as a charity. And if you're going to get a tax savings on the charitable contribution, you have to be legally recognized as a charity. If it's over $250, then you want some type of written acknowledgement. If you're trying to write off an item and you're claiming that the value of that item is more than $500 of that single item. So I'm not talking about donating a bunch of clothes and couches and chairs, because there's probably not a single item there that represents $500 or more. But if there's a single item that's more than $500, you technically need some kind of an appraisal on it, combined with the fact that the rules for donating cars and RVs and stuff like that are, in fact, much more technically driven and require an actual number in terms of the value that you're getting written off. But those are some of just the baseline things that you've got to observe in terms of how to make those charitable contributions deductible even in the first place. Setting aside whether you're able to itemize or not, you've got to make sure it goes to a charity. You've got to make sure you get a written acknowledgement. And you've got to make sure that if it's over a single item over $500, that there's an appraisal. And charitable contributions can only be written off in the year that you made them. Okay, so you can't make a charitable contribution in January and be like, oh, well, I intended to make this in December, so I'm just going to put it on my prior year taxes. It will not work that way. Charitable contributions always follow the year in which you give them. So with that backdrop, qualified charitable distribution, it's a great option if you've got a required minimum distribution on your retirement accounts, but a lot of people don't have that. So what are some of the other things that we can do with the backdrop of a higher standard deduction and less people itemizing? We've got some very specific things, and we're going to share that with you. We're going to slide to the break. We get back from the break, we'll tee that part up and then continue the conversation here on Dollars and Cents. This is Joel Garris of Nelson Financial Planning on News Radio WFLA Orlando. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Dollars and Cents here with your host, Joel Garris of Nelson Financial Planning, talking a little bit about some charitable contribution tricks that you can do on your taxes. As you probably know, the rules on being able to deduct charities have changed a little bit. Not necessarily that the rules per se for making a charitable contribution have changed, but rather how you're able to actually make the deduction has changed, because The standard deduction is so much higher now than it used to be. If you're going to deduct charitable contributions specifically, then you have to itemize your deductions. Well, less people are itemizing their deductions because they wind up going and using the standard deduction because that is so much higher that it's more advantageous to use that higher number. So, with that backdrop, what are some things that you might be able to do to try and still get the benefit of that charitable contribution in other ways from a tax perspective? We talked about the qualified charitable distribution. That's a great trick if you have to take a required minimum distribution from your retirement accounts. But if you don't have to take a required minimum distribution, what are some of the other things that you can do? Well, first of all, it involves looking at the types of things that you might be able to donate. So one of the things that you can always donate to a charity is stocks or mutual funds or any type of asset like that. And the tax trick that you could potentially do on that is, let's say it's a stock or a mutual fund that you've had for quite some time and there's a gain inside of it. Well, if you give the charity that stock or mutual fund and re-register that over to their name, then two things happen. Number one, you get to take the full value of that stock or fund as your charitable donation, and because you did not sell it before you gave it to the charity, you don't have to recognize the capital gain on your tax return that's part of that stock or mutual fund's appreciation. So what that means is that you're able to avoid the taxes that would otherwise apply if you were to sell that asset and then subsequently write the check. So one great trick to do is to simply give that stock or that fund over to the charity and then let them sell it, because the reality is the charity, if it's a legally recognized charity, it's not going to pay any taxes on that. So you avoid the taxes that would typically apply if you were to sell that on your end and then write the check. So consider giving gifts of appreciated assets like stocks or funds to a charity. That's a great way to still get some tax advantage on that charitable contribution. On the flip side, if you've got an asset where you've lost money, then you want to sell that first and convert that to money and then write a check to the charity. Because if you sell it and it's a loss, then that becomes a write-off that you can use on your tax return. If you just simply give that stock or mutual fund over to the charity and there's a loss, well, then there's no tax savings and there's no tax effect on that when the charity subsequently sells that. But if you sell it first, then you're able to use that loss. So it kind of works sort of the opposite way. If you've got an asset that's a gain, you want to give that to the charity and have them sell it and avoid the taxes on that gain. If you've got an asset that's at a loss, you want to sell it, get that loss on your tax return, and then you can turn around and just give that cash to the charity. So a couple little tricks there in terms of giving money to a charity that would generate some tax savings beyond sort of the usual charitable contributions. And that's particularly important because, as we said, less people are able to do that write-off of charitable contributions because of that higher standard deduction. Of course, other trick that you've got to get around that higher standard deduction is the notion of trying to bunch together your charitable contributions. Let's say you make some charitable contributions here at year end. What you could do is you could pull forward what you would typically make next year into this year, and then you would effectively be doubling up for this year, remembering that when you make a charitable contribution, it's the year in which you make the charitable contribution that matters. So if you pull it from next year into this year, you basically sort of double it up from a tax perspective, and then that may allow you to get above the threshold that is the standard deduction now, and so consequently you're able to get a benefit from your charitable contributions by doing it that way. So one trick is certainly to pull it from a subsequent year and sort of do that sort of classic bunching things up and that would allow you to potentially get a benefit from your charitable contribution. So some interesting tricks there in terms of how it plays all out on charitable contributions in light of today's world and where the tax code is, particularly with that higher standard deduction. Speaking of things that have changed, it's amazing how quickly things have changed with the yield curve. If you recall, the media was at crisis mode not more than 2 or 3 months ago. As a matter of fact, I was interviewed in the morning on Bud Hedinger's show, and then in the evening on Michael Yaffe's show, and both of them had me on the show about the inverted yield curve 3 months ago, hand-wringing. We're very concerned about the inverted yield curve because what that phenomenon was is it meant that the interest rate or yield on the 2-year Treasury note had actually gone to be a little bit higher than on the long-term 10-year Treasury note. It's what is known as an inverted yield curve inversion, and there's a lot of statistics out there that suggest that when you see an inverted yield curve, it usually means that a recession is forthcoming. What's interesting about how things have so dramatically changed over the course of just the past several weeks is the inverted yield curve is like now no longer. It's actually has shifted dramatically into a steep yield curve with the yield on the 10-year Treasury moving by over 40 basis points by 0.4%. Certainly some interesting things. Another good example of how the media can often get fixated on something and make it into a bigger thing and cause a lot of hand-wringing, and then lo and behold, fast forward just a few weeks, and now the yield curve is signaling not just that things are fine economically, but in fact that you may very well have faster economic growth ahead based upon a yield curve that no longer looks like that, but rather looks like that and has steepened quite a bit. So an interesting update on what was a hot topic, a headline topic not more than 3 months ago in terms of the inverted yield curve, and that was bad, and it meant that a recession was starting, and now we fast forward and we see that all of those numbers have completely dramatically changed, and the yield curve, which is basically looking at the interest rates that apply at different maturities or loan dates for U.S. Treasury securities, U.S. government issued debt. Is it going to be paid back within 2 years? Is it going to be paid back within 10 years? That yield or that interest rate on that different debt makes up the yield curve, and it's gone from that inverted hand-wringing recession starts tomorrow to a completely different look. So we thought we would take a minute and update our audience on that, because obviously that's the kind of stuff that the media is not going to talk about because there's no hand-wringing involved in that. They only like to bring that topic up when, in fact, it is inverted and creates some hand-wringing. So the latest no news on it is good news is certainly applies when we look at the yield curve and how much that has changed since just a few weeks ago. So we thought we would take a moment and update you on that, particularly against the backdrop of the week that was, the impeachment creating just a big yawn from the markets, right? Interesting stuff. And the update on the yield curve certainly is that. We're going to take a break. When we get back from the break, we will continue the conversation. We'll talk about some ways that you can avoid probate. Next up on the program, Dollars and Cents. This is Joel Garris of Nelson Financial Planning on News Radio, WFLA, Orlando. Welcome back to the program, ladies and gentlemen. Dollars and Cents here on News Radio, WFLA. This is Joel Garris, your host of Nelson Financial Planning. And on this segment of the program, we thought we would talk about a little bit of ways to avoid probate. We constantly have this question of well, I have a will, so doesn't that avoid probate? And in fact, the exact opposite of that is true. If you have a will, then you wind up actually going through probate on that will. A will is the document that provides the blueprint for what's going to happen during the probate proceedings in court. If you don't have a will, then there's no blueprint. You're still in court. Well, you're not in court because you're dead, but your beneficiaries are in court. And now the blueprint is whatever is provided by the state statute. So the point of the will is only to give a blueprint to that court proceeding that is in fact known as probate. So a will does not avoid probate. So let's get that on the table right out of the gate, because that is probably one of the biggest misconceptions out there, is that having a will avoids probate. It does not. It simply provides the guideline for how the assets are going to get distributed when it goes through that court proceeding. So if the goal is to avoid probate, then the will is not going to do it. Now, that's not to say that you shouldn't have a will. You should always have a will to pick up those items that you can't pass in other ways. But we're going to talk about some of the tricks that you can use to pass what should be the vast majority of your assets without even having to step foot inside of a courtroom. Now, let's not forget that beyond a will, there are a variety of other documents that you also want to have in place. Things like a living will, which deals with a terminal condition. Things like a power of attorney, which deals with a temporary or permanent condition that allows others to make decisions on your behalf, and things like a healthcare surrogate or a HIPAA release that allows others to sort of get in and make some medical decisions for you. So you should always kind of have that other combination of those ancillary documents as well, along with the will. But if the goal is to avoid the court proceeding of probate, then there are ways to do that beyond the will, because the will is not going to do it. So one of the things, of course, you can do to avoid all of this is give money away now. Now, obviously, there's pros and cons on that. The biggest pro is the money's no longer yours, and you may, in fact, need it for later on. But that's certainly one way to certainly avoid probate, is if you make gifts now, then those assets will not be part of your estate when you pass. I'm always cautious on advising people to do that, because we just don't know what the future may hold, what those healthcare costs may be. And so consequently, I would say to folks, if you're going to give money away, do so very cautiously and make sure that it's not more money than what you ultimately can really afford, especially with the unknown costs of healthcare that may potentially be coming up in your latter years. So that's one option, but there's other options to tackle that allow you to avoid probate. Chief among them is simply through titling of assets. So one of the things that you can do is a joint ownership with another party. Now, there's two different types of joint ownership. One is going to go very smoothly and one is not. So make sure that you have the right one, particularly if you're trying to avoid probate. So there's a joint tenancy with rights of survivorship. If it's a married couple, that's sometimes referred to as a tenancy by the entireties. What happens with those is, because there's a rights of survivorship, something happens to one person, it automatically goes to the other person. In doing so, it completely avoids probate. However, if it's a tenancy in common, then there's no rights of survivorship. And so tenancy in common interests will in fact wind up going to probate, because there's no specifically named successor owner on that piece. So know the difference between a joint tenancy with rights of survivorship versus a tenancy in common. A tenancy in common is going to have to be probated, and in fact can be quite messy, because there you're dealing with multiple people, some of which may very well still be alive, some of which may have passed. The tenancy in common winds up being very convoluted in terms of how that ultimately plays out. But know that there are two different types of joint tenancy. Typically for married couples, there's an assumption that it's a tenancy by the entireties, and so that rights of survivorship automatically flows. But if you own a property with someone that is not your spouse, or an asset with someone that is not your spouse, make sure that you double check that the rights of survivorship exist if you want that to go to that other person and you want to specifically avoid probate on it. If it's a tenancy if it's tenancy in common, then that's not going to happen and you're going to run into an issue on that. So make sure that when we talk about a joint tenancy or a joint registration, that you've got the one that you really want if your goal is to try and avoid probate. On other assets, you can name payable on death, transfer on death. There's a host of options that you can do there. A handful of states allow you to do a transfer on death on a vehicle. Florida is not one of them. Most other states sort of assume that it's personal property. Similarly, you can do a transfer on death on a piece of real estate in many states. Again, though, Florida is not one of them. So in Florida, you would have to use a vehicle called a ladybird deed, which basically is an enhanced life estate that allows you to do a transfer on death like type of registration on that property. The other option that allows you to avoid probate if assets are titled in accordance with this document is a trust. So if you've got a trust, then as long as the assets are titled in the name of the trust, then those assets are going to pass outside of probate. A trust is something, though, that we don't generally immediately advise because there's a cost involved in that, and oftentimes you can accomplish this avoidance of probate by simply using these existing transfer on death, TOD, payable on death, POD types of designations that allow those assets to pass without having to go through probate anyway. But a trust is certainly an option to be able to do that. Another option is if the estate is smaller, then you may be able to just have a small estate administration or small estate provision and not have to go through the process of probate. But the reality is that a will is not how you avoid probate, and you've got to be aware of that and make sure that you look specifically at the titling of the assets that you have, because the titling is going to determine whether they go through probate or not. And pay particular attention to assets that you own jointly with somebody that is not your spouse. Make sure that if you want that other owner to ultimately be the owner if you die, and that's also avoids having to take that asset through probate, that you make sure that there's a joint tenancy with rights of survivorship on it and not a tenancy in common, because a tenancy in common is going to require your interest to have to go through probate. So be aware of the differences in those registrations and how that all works. And certainly those are some of the tricks in which you can use to try and avoid probate, which of course is something that you want to do unless you like going to court, unless you like paying legal fees, unless you like to having things take longer than they really should. So the answer is take a look at what you own and make sure that you're covered across the board on it, because that will be how you can avoid probate. Anyway, we will wrap it on up. We want to take a moment and certainly wish our listening audience a very Merry Christmas. And we'll look forward to coming back next week, and we'll probably delve quite a bit into our fearless forecast for the year 2020. Hard to believe, 2020, around the corner indeed. Hope you all have a very Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, and enjoy the holiday season. This has been Dollars and Cents with your host, Joel Garris of Nelson Financial Planning on News Radio, WFLA, Orlando.